Hi. Do we have a second Matthew Tafoya here?
Oh, it looks like we do. This may. Hello, other Matthew.
That's Dr. Trosper.
Ah, are we expecting you, Dr. Trosper?
Well, I found an
I-
invitation in my calendar this morning, so I thought I was invited.
I invited him.
What's the
Oh,
deal?
okay, great. Okay. All right. Are you going to be speaking or just listening?
It said panelist, so I think I'm just listening, maybe commenting if I have something to say.
Okay, well, I will leave that up to the first Matthew to
Yeah, I just invited him. I wasn't sure how it was going to play out. And I invited a bunch of people. So
Okay, all
but I
right.
wasn't expecting a panel or anything like that. It was just an invitation to check it out.
Oh, sure, that's fine. We have there's two different link types. One for panelists and one for attendees. So it looks like you sent your panelist link, which is fine.
Okay,
But
I'm
none
sorry
of
about
the other attendees, you won't see anyone else unless it's the people you invited. You won't see the faces of the other folks who are joining, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Excellent.
I'm gonna go ahead and cut my video.
I'll probably do the same.
Okay, well,
Yep.
nice to meet you. Thank you
Nice
for
to meet
joining us.
you. Yes, thank you.
All right. All right. Well, I just caught the end of some of your conversation with Ben, and as an executive director myself, I feel some of your pain there. Definitely head cheerleaders for
Yeah,
sure.
it's endemic. I can't say it's just to Navajo. I've been to 30, 40 different reservations and they all pretty much function the same.
Yeah.
And that's one of the biggest things we need to work out. And that's why I picked the Native Nation building model to get us out of this, because it's a recipe for success or a facilitation strategy for
Oh,
social
sure.
development.
Oh, fantastic. I'm really excited to hear about it. Really excited to read about the research that you're going to be presenting and uh, hopefully find out if there's anything that we can do to assist. So, all right. If everybody who is joining us, we are just at about 4 o'clock. So we're going to head and get started. I'm Liz Perry with Crow Canyon, and I will be moderating our webinar today. Before we introduce our distinguished speaker, I'd like to begin with our acknowledgement. Crow Canyon acknowledges the Pueblo, Ute, Paiute, Dene, and Hickory Apache people on whose traditional homelands our campus sits. We acknowledge the first people of this land, the human people, the animal people, plant people, water people, rock people. We ask permission of the first people to enter this space and make a promise that our words, deeds, thoughts, and actions will be honorable to them. Our work here at Crow Canyon is not possible without Indigenous people in the past, present, and future, and we respectfully recognize and honor ancestral and descendant Indigenous communities for their contributions to all humankind. We are grateful to all Indigenous people and support the preservation and protection of cultural traditions, ancestral connections, and sacred lands. If you are joining us on Zoom today during the talk, if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A section here, circled in red at any time. We do keep an eye on the chat, but if people are chatting, sometimes the questions get lost. We will do our best to get to any questions at the end of the presentation that are in the Q&A. If Zoom gives you a headache, we are live streaming on Facebook, and you can also subscribe to our YouTube channel to see this and our past webinars. So we only have 2 webinars left in the year after this. Next week, we have Continuity Through Creation, a living culture through the art of the Zuni people with 5 Zuni artists. We will not have a webinar on November 28th, and then we'll move into the next week, which will be our final webinar of the year with Todd Surabel talking about the first people in the Americas. As always, thank you to everyone. This is an entirely free webinar series. We can only do this because of your donations. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We see people donate every week that you sign up for a webinar, and it really makes a difference. It is now my honor to introduce our speaker today, Matthew Tafoya, who is currently the director of the Navajo Tech Innovation Center in Church Rock, New Mexico. His educational background is in justice studies, business, economic development, green infrastructure, American Indian studies, Native nation building, climate change adaptation, food sovereignty and security, built environments and health promotion. His interests are in developing Indigenous economic ecologies, social ecologies, indigenizing Native institutions, improving governance, and creating new institutions that adapt to colonization, climate change, and colonial constructs like Indian reservations. He believes in tribal sovereignty, self-determination, self-governance, and working with community to develop community. His hobbies include permaculture, cultural preservation, rebuilding food systems, outdoor recreation, travel, and learning from other cultures. It's just the little things, Matthew, such an incredible work that you're doing. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right. If you want to share your slides, you should be able to call those up.
Sure, how do I do that?
Okay. Just like we did a second ago in the practice with Ben.
Yeah, so just open up your PowerPoint and then at the very bottom, click that green share arrow,
Perfect.
and then you can go to presenter view or click slideshow at the top and show from beginning, and then that will put it in a full screen mode. So if you go to the top bar in the orange and click slideshow,
There you go.
and then
John?
all the way on the left is from the beginning. Perfect.
Okay. So we're on?
Looks great. Yep, that looks perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. So yes, my name is Matthew Tafoya. I am a Koshchea, born for the Tewa Corn clan, which is the Santa Clara Tewa. My Che's are the Tatnazani, and my Nallis are the Tewa Winter clan, which is also from Santa Clara. So I'm half Pueblo and half Navajo, and I'm married and I live on the Navajo Nation. And I wanted to give this presentation to share with principally several different organizations or several different audiences. One is practitioners working in Indian country, because there's not a lot of communication taking place among practitioners, and a lot of them are dealing with the exact same problems, and also academia and also governments and tribal governments. So I got a grant, or I didn't get a grant. I worked for an organization that got a grant from 2014 to 2017 to increase access to healthy food and beverages in the Fort Defiance agency. And it was from the CDC. So that was what paid for this. And this was an action grant. It wasn't a research grant. But because I had just graduated right at that time, I was in, research mode. So it basically follows a research orientation of how we carried out the grant. And my PI was in the same boat as me. He was also at U of A, just like me. And so we approached it as a research grant, even though it wasn't. It was an action grant. And we had some problems to deal with. And these problems existed before I was brought on board. And they were basically that Navajo diabetes prevalence rate is 34%. And the pre-diabetes is 33%. So basically 2/3 of Navajo population are not doing good health-wise. Navajo Nation is a food desert considered by the USDA, and it's on the USDA food map. When you go type in the Navajo Nation map and you transpose it with the food desert, they're right on top of each other. Navajo households experience 76% food insecurity, and that was done by a study by Pardilla and his colleagues in 2014. Healthy food is only available in limited supply and often seasonal, and is very expensive on the Navajo Nation. You don't have a lot of options for food, and what is available is usually not very healthy, if it's available at all. And that the key part on the at all part, because a lot of places don't even have it available. So 4 out of 16 Navajo chapters, this grant served have grocery stores. And at that time, that was what it was. Since that time, one grocery store has closed, but another grocery store has opened. So it's the same stats, it just moved the locations. So that means, 3/4 of the Navajo communities that this grant served still doesn't have access to healthy food, or any kind of food for that matter. It's just a no-go zone, pretty much. You have food in gas stations, but that's considered a completely different thing. In terms of the studies that they did, they usually look at grocery stores, so they discount convenience stores and gas stations. And oftentimes, the food at the convenience store and gas stations is the only food you have available, and that's usually like fried burritos and chips and stuff like that. And I'm guilty. I've eaten plenty of that stuff because that was pretty much all that was available. So driving to access healthy food off the res is time-consuming and expensive. There's been several studies done. Van Westerhoven is just one of them. But they all basically say the same thing, that if you live in the interior part of the Navajo Nation, that you have to drive 50 to 75 miles to one way to access food. And it's still not the greatest food to choose from. I mean, yeah, it gets you to Walmart, but you're still dealing with food that's not organic or genetically modified. It's got all the stuff in it that everybody else has, but it's no different than the basic foods that the rest of America eats. Navajo people have disconnected from traditional food. This is one of the things that it's a big problem out here at Navajo, because a lot of people want to reconnect with it, but we don't know how to reconnect with it because the social ecology, the environment, the resources around here are not conducive for accessing traditional food, and a lot of it's just not available. Like a lot of the berries that used to be available are no longer available because we've degraded the ecology to the point that it's not available anymore. And people are unhealthy because the environment's unhealthy. I didn't cite anybody. I know someone had said that before me, so that's not my statement. And that's been said over and over, but I couldn't find out exactly who said that to give it a correct citation. But I'm not the first person to say that. That's just one of my observations. So the problem is big, and it's not just Navajo problem. This is a problem that exists pretty much all over the reservations, particularly in the Western United States. I've had experience where I had the opportunity to visit over 200 reservations, and I found the problems across the board pretty much everywhere. I only found maybe out of those 200 reservations in the West, 3 or 4 of them are not dealing with these problems. They actually have it figured out and they're doing good. All the rest are pretty much in the same boat. And at Navajo, we're the biggest boat, so it's a big problem out here. And I attended several different CDC trainings, and they would always point us in different directions and using, always follow the Western best practices and all that stuff. And I was like, yeah, that's fine, but we're a different situation. A lot of them focused on self-efficacy using the medical model, which is the old standard approach of focusing on the individual and individual choices. And the standard approach is basically, if you have the information, that you will make good decisions and you'll be healthy. Well, now we know that's not the case. And social ecology as a theory really kicked in around 2010, I would say. And it's still new, even though it's been embedded into the public health systems. A lot of the public health programmers have not fully embraced it. Even like when I was in Tucson, I attended the Healthy People 2020. Out of their 19 different propositions, only one of them dealt with social ecology because they were so embedded in self-efficacy. And that was a problem I came across too as well. But my solution was to focus on the social ecology, the environment, because I had learned that the social ecology is basically humans create an environment, and then the environment in turn creates humans. And I like that. So I thought, well, since our environment is does not have a lot of the things we want, those are the things that we want. And so it took a turn in a strange way, because even though our grant dealt with social ecology, the community wanted something completely different. And I'll get into that very shortly. But I wanted to say that the solution is really focus on the social ecology. So before I came on board to do this grant, there was already a team put in place who got together, and they were part of the community health department. And they got to pick out a whole bunch of interventions that they thought would improve the social ecology. And so here's some of them. There was a few more, but these are the main ones. So it was basically increase the number of grocery stores with healthy store promotions from 0 to 2, increase the number of farmers markets from 2 to 5, increase the number of healthy food concession stands from 2 to 4, increase worksite wellness programs from 2 to 4, or 0 to 2, I'm sorry, increase the number of health councils from 0 to 2, and improve school menus with new policies and healthy menu options from 0 to 2. And at this time, a lot of these programs did not exist. That's why they're starting off at 0. And a lot of these interventions were seemingly good at first. At least when I got there, I thought, okay, I can try to pull this off. But once I started trying to do them, I realized that a lot of the stores were open to healthy promotion. That was a good thing, because I thought they weren't going to be, but they were open. They're like, yeah, diabetes is a problem in my family too. I would love to see some kind of unified approach to promote healthy food. So that wasn't a problem. But increasing the number of farmers markets, this happened right after the Gold King mine spill. And at that time, my strategy was to invite food growers from the Four Corners area to come down here to sell their food. But that wasn't going to happen, because when I went up there to try to recruit and see what the situation was, assess the situation, I found out that a lot of the growers were feeling discriminated against because they came from the Four Corners area. Nobody wanted to buy their vegetables because they thought it was watered from the Gold King mine spill, and they thought it was poison. So for that first year and two, nobody wanted food from that area. And that really, it put a kink in the farmers market initiative. I'll get into that a little bit more later too. Increase the number of healthy concession stands. So at Navajo Nation, we don't have a lot of food places. They're here and they're growing, but we do have a lot of food stands that pop up at the flea markets and the side of the road. And one of the things that the grant wanted to work on was to try to get healthy food into those stands. And we did do that initially, but one of the biggest problems we had was they didn't last very long, or they went out of business very fast. The people who focused on healthy food did not stay in business. And we had initially supported 3 different businesses, paid for their marketing material, their promotions, and helped them get noticed. But nobody wanted to eat healthy food at that time, so they went out of business. And that was just an endemic problem that we just couldn't deal with, because we didn't know how to get people to eat healthy. People didn't want to eat healthy. And then increased worksite wellness programs. That was another interesting program or intervention, because worksite wellness programs pretty much didn't exist out here before we started doing them. And our initial attempt at them was really to monitor human health with these little bracelets that you wear on your wrist. And at that time, well, now it's popular, but at that time, people thought it was too invasive, and they didn't want to have anybody tracking their body, anything. And at that time, I agreed with it too, because I thought it was too invasive. I didn't think worksite wellness programs, we should be tracking individual health. I thought we should be focusing more on the social ecology. But that worksite wellness program and this orientation fell apart because nobody wanted to be monitored. And yeah, it just was not supported at all. And increase the number of health councils from 0 to 2. Now, this was a really interesting one. This is the one that really ties into the CBPR. And initially, when this happened, or when I came on job, we were promoting health councils, because I really liked that idea, because for me, it was really putting the local community in charge of designing their community and what's important for them, and figuring out their needs, their wants, their priorities, what assets they have, and what resources they can marshal to deal with these issues. And it was problematic in the sense that some councils were embraced by chapters. Like some chapters were like, great, we need this, we love this, let's make it happen. And we had several of them that were launched, and they were beautiful. They included youth, people, in-laws, people who are not citizens of the Navajo Nation, but lived in the community. And it was really just people who are in the community, who are invested in the community and want the community to be healthier. And they were actually given the domain authority to make decisions and a budget by the council. And this was at a time right when the Healthy Denomination Act was being passed. And once it passed, then that created a funding source for the health councils to actually operate. One of the problems, there was a few problems with the health councils. They were mainly political. Some of the health councils were viewed as political adversaries to the current leadership. And so some of them were just done away with because they were threatened by them, essentially. And the interesting thing is, in some of those communities, the health council ran for office after they were discontinued and they won. So it was a political threat. It was a real political threat. But it was a good one because it was people who really care about the community. But at the Navajo local governance level, it was considered a threat. And so some of them were done away with. However, some communities, they were emboldened and given more power and authority because they liked what they were doing and they wanted them to do more, and they did. And I'll show that a little farther on too. And improve school menus with new policies and healthy menu options. That was an interesting one. I was really excited about that one, but that was the one I got the most pushback from, because when we went to the schools, they were like, we're already following state standards and that's all we have to do. And that's all we're going to do. So I was like, okay. But there were some schools who said, you know what, we can do better. What are your suggestions? So we presented a whole series of suggestions of how we can do farm to table or composting out of the kitchen. And we had several schools that were open to it. And even like little, not even schools, but the preschools were particularly receptive to these initiatives. And some of them started the very first Navajo food policy school, farm to table school programs on the reservation. And they're still in existence today, and they're even grown. I drive past one every day, and I just love looking at their setup because it's growing. It went from where we left it, and they've continued to grow it and grow it. And I just love driving past it because now the orchards are producing apples, and it's just gorgeous to see. But not all the schools were on board with that initially. Yeah, some of them were just like, no, we're already following the state law, and that's all we have to do, and that's all we're going to do. I'd say that was a story for about 80% of the schools. So we realized pretty soon that a lot of these interventions are not going to work. But I did my best to carry them out the first year. And it was until the second year we got to change them. Those are the redetermined interventions. And the redetermined interventions are basically based on all the community input from the first year. What we learned the first year is that really nobody was in line with those interventions. And a lot of those interventions didn't really make a lot of sense, especially the store ones, because the stores would only cover 25% of our service or community area. But these interventions would cover all of them. And these are the interventions that I got a lot of pushback because the institution I was working for at that time had never done these type of approaches before. Oh, they did, actually, they did. But it wasn't at the scale. And that created some problems, but it also created opportunities. So I always kind of try to turn a problem into an opportunity. And one of the things, or all of the different intervention sites, and I'm talking 16 different communities, 45,000 different people. No matter where I went, everybody were just like, who picked these interventions? And I was like, so-and-so did, or whatever. They're like, how come we can't grow our own food? And I was like, well, actually we can, but it's not the interventions that we picked. And they said, well, why don't you make it an intervention? And at that time, we had a TA from this technical assistant from the CDC, and he was not really against it, but he was just really strict to the book. So he wasn't for it, and he really wouldn't allow for it. And it wasn't until we were able to sneak in a application to the hospital that I worked at to have the nurses approve a garden, and that created the precedent for community gardens. If the nurses can have it, then that became a precedent that everyone else can have it too. And it was perfect timing because we got a brand new TA on board from the CDC, and he was all for community supported agriculture. In fact, he was like, how come you guys aren't doing community supported agriculture? Because I didn't get to pick the interventions. But I said, everybody in our intervention sites, they want to grow their own food, period. I mean, that's the only intervention they really, really want. And I'm getting pushback from the CDC in my chain of command. And he's like, well, we can change that. You're going into the second year. As long as you gave a full attempt on the first year, and which you did, and you accomplished most of your goals, that now you can change them. So I was like, okay, well, I want to change them. He's like, well, you're welcome to. And so we said, okay, we want to go community gardens, school gardens, and just go all on that, and then work more on the farmers markets to try to build them up in terms of administration and infrastructure and organization, and work with our worksite wellness programs. But instead of moving the individual health monitoring apparatus, to switch it to gardens and built environments for recreation and stuff like that. And it was approved. So we were like, great, now we have a brand new mission, completely different than the first year, full backing of the community. And I mean, big time, like the community did not want to do any of that stuff on the initial page. But this one, they were like all in, especially with traditional food. And this was brand new for me. So this is, I mean, I had been a gardener before this, but I wasn't particularly aware of what traditional foods are and how to access the seeds. I knew nothing about farmers markets, and I knew very little about worksite wellness programs, but we were jumping in. So I said, okay, let's do this. And we went for it. But I didn't do this on my own. So I have to give credit to the full crew. We had a principal investigator, Dominic Clichy from University of Arizona, myself. Our evaluator was also from University of Arizona, Dr. Penley Strauss, and then our staffs, Yvonne Stanley, Lyle City, Kelsey Thompson, Miranda Yazzie, Cynthia Yazzie, Nadia Clyde, Eric Canuho, Emery Tohi, Cheryl Willie, and we had, I think, 12 or 14 different interns, separate interns in 2 different years. It was a long list, but these were the people who really made it happen. These were the boots on the ground. This was the familiar face. These are the people who develop the relationships with the communities, and that's very important. If you're going to do anything in any country, you have to have a solid relationship with the people you work with. So I give full credit to these people. They made this happen. It was not just me. And this is basically what we were dealing with at the grocery stores, at the gas stations, and convenience stores. On the left, that's pretty much what's available on the reservation, and soda and chips and stuff like that. And we wanted to move to the right. We wanted access to healthy food, traditional food, locally grown food, organic food, food that's free of chemicals and petrol, chemicals and politics. That's what we wanted. And so we had to get in line with that. And that was difficult for the organization I worked for because they had never done that before. And I was kind of in the middle person trying to figure out, find a balance between what's happening in the food situation currently and where we want to go. And I knew we had to do some new stuff. The old approaches weren't working. Like I said, our institution had tried some of this before, and they had met some success. I'll give them credit for that, but it had never taken off and had never scaled up or grown or developed. It just kind of was a one-time grand ended. But what people wanted to do was basically they wanted access to the food, and we had to figure out ways to make that happen. So we thought it would be best to combine indigenous knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, food science, food knowledge with Western science and best practices. And that actually led to some really good outcomes. But before we go into that, I want to create some context that Navajo Nation was a reservation, even though we're in our homeland and we're in charge now, but it wasn't always that way. Before that, we were at Bosque Redondo, and then we got allowed to come back home. And on the left, you see the original reservation, and that was our first reservation. So that was our first social ecology, and it was moving from basically one concentration camp, Huilti or Fort Sumner, to another concentration camp. And then it got to expand into, on the left or the right-hand side, you see the current reservation, and that's where we are today. But regardless of us being a sovereign society, it's still a colonial construct. I mean, all reservations are colonial constructs, even though we like to pump ourselves up and say, oh yes, tribal sovereignty, we're in charge. That's relatively new. And most people are barely realizing what that actually is now. So one of the things that I wanted to, that I learned during this process, and I'm really trying to promote now, is that Navajo was, it's a food desert according to the USDA, but it wasn't always a food desert. 170 years ago, we were 100% food sovereign and had 100% food security, and starving was not a problem. Now it is. And I wondered, how did that happen? Well, I'm not an idiot, most people aren't. We knew it was colonization. And during the Navajo War, I found out some specific details that Kit Carson's plan was basically to starve us into submission. And then that had worked. That's another Western best practice that worked with the Civil War. It worked on the South. They did a scorched earth campaign in the southern United States, and it worked. They destroyed their food system, and they had nothing to eat, and they surrendered. And they said, okay, hey, that's a best practice. Let's take that out west and apply it to the Indian reservations. And it worked there too with the buffalo, with Navajo, and specifically, there's a book by Frank McKnight called Navajo Warfare, Reprisals, and Raiding, and he talks a lot about that process. And during the Navajo War, basically 2 million pounds of food was destroyed, 20,000 fruit trees were cut down or shot down. Hundreds of wells were poisoned, and livestock was expropriated to pay the allies of the US to give to the Utes, the Zuni, the Acoma, the San Domingos, the Jemez, all the different tribes who participated in hunting down Navajos. They were paid with slaves, livestock, and booty from the raids. So that contributed to shaping the social ecology as well. And fields, gardens were burned down and destroyed. And if whatever they couldn't burn and take away, what they couldn't burn and destroy, they took away and they fed to the animals and the army and gave to the allies. So the Navajo was made a food desert during the Navajo War as part of the Scorched Earth campaign, and it was successful. It worked. So yeah, that's another best practice, is that Scorched Earth campaigns work. And that was part of the bigger colonization agenda. You know, health disparities, I'm saying that they're not a happenstance thing. And this is interesting because when I first attended a CDC training back when I first got that pitch job, I went to the training in Atlanta, and it was by the CDC folks. And this was all the different pitch programs. There was probably like 200 people there. And one of the ladies who was presenting said, does anybody know why Native Americans have poor and declining health? And not one person raised their hand. So I thought, well, shoot, I might as well. So I did. And she picked me and she's like, what's your answer? Colonization. And she said, no, it's not colonization. And I was like, well, what is it then? She said, Native Americans have a starvation gene. And I was like, okay. I thought that was turned upside down in the 90s, the late 90s, 1998, I thought. But apparently people were still thinking that. But so at that time, this was 2015, that the idea at the government level is that Native Americans have a starvation gene, and that's why we're so unhealthy. Doesn't make any sense, but that was what they were saying. So I was like, okay, I mean, I'll take that with a grain of salt. But I knew in my own heart, because of experience and what I see on a daily basis, that that's an engineered outcome. When you study the early days of reservations, and I think it was Braveheart and Yellow Thunder who wrote a book on that, and they talk about how the very first earliest days of reservation period, like your first year on the reservation, saw basically a 50% mortality rate. And that's pretty consistent across the board when you look at least at Western reservations. And then when you consider the boarding schools, it was also first year, a 50% mortality rate. So whether you're going to the reservation or you're going to the boarding school, you only have about a 50% chance to live your first year. And that this colonization process, it lasted a long time for Navajos. We had the Spanish period, the Mexican period, the American period. All of them were brutal and devastating. But there were some positive things that came out of it, like we were able to get livestock and access to some food. But basically, it was during that colonization period, Indigenous ownership of the land went from 100% to 2% of where it is today. And on the United States federal side of things, I make the argument that federal policies shaped our social ecologies. So if we look at the different eras, and there's basically 5, 6, 7 of them, depending on how you want to break it down, and there is overlap, that the treaty making period went from the colonial period up into 1871 when it was ended by Congress. And that was basically the time where they would get treaties with tribes, peace treaties mainly, get them to stay on reservations or relocate and take control of the trade and intercourse. And it was also the time of legal land grabs. Basically, treaties were just the mechanism for legal land grabs. And that ended in 1871, but it really curbed until the 1830s. The next big period or era was the removal. And removal basically took on two different shapes. It was the eastern tribes were moved west of the Mississippi by Jackson. And then on the western side of the Mississippi, western tribes were amalgamated or concentrated onto reservations, hence the concentration camps. And so that was taking place at both ends of the United States. And it took a while, 30 years, even longer than that. And then the next big ones was once everybody was on reservations, and then they started whittling away at the reservations. So we had two big policies that came with that. One was the Dawes Allotment Act and the assimilation that came with it. They were hand in hand. The Dawes Allotment Act, depending on who you read, Kurt Kickingbird says 100 million acres. Other people like Williams and Getches say is 90 million. Basically, a lot of land was taken during that time. And it was done by creating 160 acres per person and then declaring the rest surplus. And the surplus land was opened up for non-Indian usurpation, to put it. On the assimilation side, besides reducing land and making people fee simple owners, was that they wanted to kill the Indian and save the man. And that was General Pratt's idea, that they would use the military to indoctrinate Native Americans into the Western ways of thinking and doing. And that really meant separating families or separating children from their families and putting them into school so they could learn English and learn how to be a white person and be successful in society. And that was another best practice. It worked, but it also killed a lot of people and did a lot of harm as well. And then that lasted, I say 1934, but that really lasted, the assimilation period went up to like 1976 before it finally came to an end. The next big era was reorganization. That was John Collier's, where they went around trying to get governments to reform, to look more like an American government with the Constitution. And that was when they kind of realized that maybe it's a good idea that let Indians be Indians, but we'll still contain them and still be in charge of them, but we'll give them some freedom, let them organize themselves. And that never really panned out very well because the BIA was always in there and they never really allowed them to really become who they wanted to be. And then the next area was termination and urban relocation. This Termination Act, 109 tribes were terminated, 60% of the population relocated to urban centers, Santa Rosa, Phoenix, Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, or just some of the places. There was like 10, 12 different locations. They really sent a lot of people. And it was basically just to get them into job programs, get some school, and blend them into American society. And that had some negative and positive elements to it. The negative was it was pulled a lot of people off the reservation and broke up the language and culture. On the positive side, it exposed a lot of Native Americans to things that they would not have been exposed to before, like how to organize a community, how to govern oneself, how to create resources in a community, and how to manage resources. Those things were not done by us before because it was always done by the BIA. But when people came back, they're like, hey, we can do this. We can do this better than the BIA. So it changed the way people thought on the reservation, and that was an unintended consequence of relocation. And the big era that we're in today and changed everything was tribal self-determination. It started in 1968 with, I believe it was part of Nixon's program, where he wanted Native Americans to take a bigger step in governing themselves. And then that was backed up in 1975. So the Indian Self-Determination Education Assistance Act of 1975 offered a legal framework for change. That's where we got the 638 process. And for people who don't know what the 638 process is, it's tied to law, public law 638, but we call it the 638. And it means basically that tribes can contract with the government to carry out the services that the government would do on the reservation. So I mean like housing, transportation, natural resource management, stuff like that. So if tribes wanted to, they could take charge of it. And it was a mechanism that allowed us to really start get into the driver's seat, really. And that would change everything. At Navajo, even though it started in 1975, it would take quite a ways, 20 years later, before the BIA finally pulled out. And from what I was told, it took a lot of advocacy by John McCain. He said, okay, BIA, you need to get out of the Indian business. We need to let them do their own thing. Get out. And it was during that time that things really started to pick up. And so when people say that, yeah, we're tribal sovereign, this is relatively new. This all happened within my lifetime. And so it's not everybody has embraced it fully, but a lot of tribes have, and a lot of tribes are doing really good with this. So we have theoretical frameworks, and under the Western side, it would basically be social ecology theory, which is basically humans create the ecology and the ecology recreates humans. That's fine and dandy, but I wanted to indigenize this process because, we're Navajo and we see things differently. We have a different perspective. So for us, our theory, we have several of them, but one of the big one is Sa'an Nagai Bakehojan. We just call it SNBH. It's a standard theory taught straight out of Dene College and Navajo Technical University. And now it's pretty much across the board. Everyone teaches it now. And it's basically what here it says, the path to old age resulting in harmony, or Hojon. So Hojon is the goal. And that's just a different way of looking at things. That we're still engineers of our social ecology and our environment, but we see it as a pathway to old age. And then not only does it stop when we're dead, but it creates again because we have children and grandchildren. So it's a iterative cyclical process. And I like that too, because it's always in line for fixing and reevaluating and tweaking it here and there and making it better. And it's based on nature. It's based on the seasons, the year, the time of the day, clockwise, all that stuff, all ties into this framework. And for us as a theory, I think it works very well for Navajo people. And I've seen other tribes have similar frameworks. Donna Otham have Oi Dog, and our Lakota brothers and sisters up north have Mitakuyasin, and they're all good theories. They just need to be like reworked and adapted to the Western models. So we don't have to use Western models completely. We can indigenize them and have our own theories represented, which makes more sense to us. So our methodology comes from the learning model, the Navajo learning model, and it's basically this Nitsihakes, which is thinking. We think best together. We have better ideas when we when we come together and we share our ideas. That's where the best ideas come from. Nahata, planning. I'm sorry, I have some typos in here. And that's basically that we plan best together. One person can plan, but a whole group together, the plan's going to be much better and more far-reaching. Ina, which is action. I call it implementation because that's the do part of it, and not that we work best together. People can make things happen by themselves, but good things happen when everybody gets on board. And Sihasin is evaluation, and that how can we improve it? How can we make it better? And I tied this in with because is what brings us together. It's our family kinship relation system. And I equalize that with CBPR because at the CBPR, community-based participatory research, there's always this big emphasis in community partnerships. But at Navajo, we're not partners, we're relatives. So it's a little deeper, or it's a lot deeper. But it's the same model, it's just way deeper. And community-based participatory research is a great facilitation strategy for folks, especially for practitioners doing anything in Indian country. If you come from an outside institution, you want to work on a tribal community, this works really well. And this has been developed and built upon. I'm just doing the basic outline on this one. And this is developed by Israel and her colleagues. And it's basically, there's 9 components of it. The 9th one was added in 2002, but it's basically recognize the community as a unit of identity. So Navajo Nation as a tribe, we're a unit of identity, builds on strengths and resources within the community. That also ties into our culture and our food system and our traditional knowledge. Even though we had been disconnected from it, the knowledge is still there, and facilitates in collaborative partnerships in all phases of the research. This was important because in order for me to carry out this process and make it be successful, the communities had to have ownership. So I didn't want to have a top-down approach. For me, it had to be horizontal or bottom up. And it promotes co-learning and empowering processes that attend to social inequities. That was when you really get a lot of people together and you're like, hey, what's wrong with this place and how can we make it better? That's when you get the feedback that deals with the social inequities, and you hear from the community of some of the really interesting and positive and empowering ways to address those. It involves a cyclical and iterative process, and this is where you create or you come up or develop a solution, you tweak it here and there, and you implement it. And while you're doing that, if you notice you need to make some course corrections or something pops up, then you make those notes and you bring it back to the community and share with them, hey, this issues came up. And issues came up with everything. And I couldn't solve them. What I was able to do, though, was bring it to the community, present it to them, and some of the best solutions they were able to come up with. There were some solutions I was not able to come up with, but some of our best solutions came from the community. And I had nothing to do with that other than just like, hey, we need to bring it to the community and see what the community has to say. And they had the solutions. Yeah. And this happened over and over and over again. It was its own iterative process. And address health from a positive and ecological perspective. For us at Navajo, that meant basically tying back into the culture. You know, it always goes to our creation stories. And the ecological perspective is like, how can we change the environment to address these issues? And they were 2 different things, but they meshed really, really well at Navajo. And I think they could work in other different tribal communities as well, because you're dealing with issues and you're dealing with from a positive perspective. So you're not just saying, oh, we're starving, we're hungry, or all this stuff. We're like, well, no, how can we feed ourselves? What food is available and how can we best access it? And if we don't have access it, can we visit our neighbors? You know, so it's always looking at things in a positive way, not a negative way. And I found that to be very informative for myself, because I tend to usually take a negative perspective on a lot of things. But after dealing with all these different inputs and collaborative initiations and stuff, that I learned to see things more from a more positive perspective, even though we were dealing with communities that didn't even have a store or no access to anything. But at one time they had that, they had 100% of it. So it wasn't like we couldn't see it, but it was part of the history and it was part of the oral history and people knew about it. So it wasn't a foreign thing, which is something that we had disconnected and that we had to reconnect with. And disseminate findings and knowledge gained to all partners. This is important too. This was part of the iterative process too. Whenever we would find something, we'd always share it back with the community. And then when we got to the end of it, we were trying to figure out ways, how can we best share this information with everybody? And it really meant just working with the different communities. So they would share it with other Navajo chapters at agency meetings and do their own different methods. Like a lot of times I would get invites to visit a chapter. They wanted me to be there to help them share some information with a different group who contacted them, but wanted to learn what they're doing, why their best practices were working. So I was really happy about that, because we got to share our information with lots of different chapters and different tribes and different communities, following the local ways of doing it, not the national conferences and stuff like that. We did that also, but I thought the more positive impact was working directly with different communities and neighbors to disseminate knowledge and our findings. And it also involves a long-term sustainable commitment to effectively reduce health disparities. I'm still doing this. And this program ended 6 years ago, and I'm still doing it. And yeah, when a project comes to an end and you're fully committed to a CBPR approach, it never comes to an end. As long as they can contact you and you're still part of the community, I'm still contacted constantly. Can you send us some resources for this? Sure. Can you do this? Yes, I can, or I can, or I know the person who you can, or here's a person you need to speak with. I'm still doing this actively today, and there's one of the slides I'll demonstrate that or give you a good example. But community-based participatory research from the Israel version is very good. It's the gold standard and still good. It's been built upon, but this is basic. This is the recipe for success at reservations, and was for me at Navajo. So that was a community engagement strategy. I decided to combine it with a social development strategy. So one's to engage the community to do the social development. So once we got the CBPR function put together and up and running, the next thing was to pick up on the Native Nation building. And this is where things really pick up. And it's basically a recipe for success. It's really only 6 of them. I added another one, but I'll get into that. So basically, it's assert decision-making power. If you have sovereign authority, you're the tribal sovereign, do it, exercise it, make it happen, claim it. Nothing's going to happen until you do it. The days of the white savior coming here to fix everything are over. The only thing that's going to happen in our place, our tribe, is if we decide to do something and then we actually do it. We have the authority to do it. And in Navajo, the chapters, Navajo Nation has authority, but they also divested or given that authority to the chapters. So chapters have that authority as well. So they don't have to wait for approval from Windrock for a lot of things. A lot of things they can move on their own. And institutions within those chapters can work with the chapters and get chapter approval to move ahead as well, like schools and such, and work sites. Back up that power with capable institutions. This was a little more of a challenge here because Navajo Nation wasn't really quite committed to create institutions, but at the chapter level, they were. And that's where the health councils come in. So the health councils really were my way of dealing with the capable institutions. So at the chapter level, if they don't have a health council, then really there's really nothing to discuss in terms of health, otherwise, other than go into the full community. But when you have a health council, they are given domain authority to deal with health, assess the situation, see what resources are out there, come up with a long-term community plan, and then that becomes the official plan for the community. So it became a capable institution. And some of them grew, and some of them are still growing. Yeah, we have some chapters that took the ideas we planted and grew it into a tree, and they no longer need us because they are fully on their own path of determining their future. We were just there as basically like cheerleaders to kind of root them on. Establish a strategic orientation objectives. Really, that's really about long-term planning, not doing anything within the next 2 years or the 4 years of the next, political cycle of when you run for office. Basically at Navajo, that's how it kind of turns out. And at the chapter level, local level, and at the national Navajo level is pretty much the same. Hardly any programs go beyond 4 years. So what we were saying is that if you're going to develop a community health plan, it's got to be long, and you have to be able to tie in all the different political cycles into it so they can support it. So we recommended doing a 102-year health plan, because for Navajo, we have this cultural idea that we're supposed to live to 102 years old, and turning 51 is just reaching halfway. And so everything requires a long-term plan. Nothing should be done short, even though currently modern Navajo functions within really short time frames. We're saying, no, expand that out and make it specific to your community. And implement, choose appropriate development projects and programs. Yeah. Don't come up with weird stuff. If you have a certain thing you want to develop in your community, like a park or a food system or orchard, develop projects and programs that complement that and support it. In the past, the standard approach would be like somebody would come out from the BIA and say, oh, you guys need to have a park here, and then they would do a park and then leave. That's fine and dandy, or it was fine and dandy in those days, but now we're in charge. So if we want to have a park, we need to figure out how that park's going to be funded, how it's going to be administered, how it's going to be maintained. all that stuff. And it has to be done by us because we're going to be the one in charge of it. There is no big Navajo Nation parks, larger recreation. I mean, there is, but they don't focus on that stuff. They could, but they don't, not now. So that's why I was saying at the local level, this is something chapters can take on and do on their own and be fully capable of. And some of them were. There are actually some chapters who are excellent at this. And implement the projects and programs. Don't stop talking about it and put them into, make them happen. Bring life to them, blow life into them, give them life. Throw in the money, put in the time, the resources, pass chapter resolutions in support of them, and keep them alive. Because programs are only alive until they're kept alive, and then they'll come to an end when people lose interest in them. And so that was really kind of the impetus for how we got these projects going. Is there wasn't so much us coming from Window-Rock or Fort Defiance saying, oh, you guys should have food sovereignty or food security. It was really the chapters figuring out how we need food security for ourselves and how can we ask you guys to help us with resources to reach these goals. So that was kind of our approach to it and our perspective. And that leadership should be strategic. Leaders should be nation builders. They should be mobilizers, and they should be transformative. They're thinking beyond their term. You know, they're thinking beyond 2 years and 4 years or 6 years. They're thinking the next 20, the next 50, the next 100 years. And what do they need to do as leaders to support that and make that happen? It usually involves including young people and management positions or creating internal management ladders of opportunity. And that all has to be done internally. And it can be done internally. For a lot of tribes, that's kind of a new thing, but a lot of tribes are really good at it now. And Navajos, we're relatively new at this process, Native nation building. We are very new at it. But it is gaining purchase or traction. And people are starting to see that it works. And they're starting to incorporate it more into their different programming. But leadership is very important because you have to think of leadership beyond yourself and your lifespan. You have to think of it for the future. When you're gone, what is the next management going to look like? How can it be better? What can we do to support the management? Do we have to allocate money so they can go to school or provide training? All those kinds of things. And it's very important. So if you're in a tribal community and you want to do something good for the community, it's always going to involve leadership, and it has to be really like a mobilizing, transformative way, because you are basically doing that. You're changing your social ecology from the colonial construct that was created to where you want to go. And a big part of that Native nation building is developing a cultural match too. And for us at Navajo, that meant, tying in the concept of Hojon as the goal and how do we get there. And at the time I was doing this was about 5 or 6 years right after the Navajo wellness model was produced. I mean, it had already been in existence in people's heads, but it became together as an official idea in 2010 when the IHS convened a bunch of Navajo medicine people together to say, how can we improve our healthcare delivery system and our healthcare programs and make them more responsive to Navajo needs. And that's when the Navajo people said, well, we already have the system, let's just adopt it. And it's basically that Hojon is the goal: health, harmony, balance. And it involves 4 areas to balance to get to that require daily balancing, and it's spiritual, mental, emotional, and physical. This is still taking hold at Navajo. It hasn't been fully grabbed by everybody, but the few people or the few organizations, institutions that have embraced it are doing wonderful things with it, but it still has a long ways to go at Navajo. So we have a lot of work to do in this area. But we call it SNBH, Sa'anagai Hojon, and it is our ontology or epistemology or methodology. It's a way of knowing, being, and doing. And it comes from our creation story, and it's founded in the 4 sacred directions. Each of our 4 sacred directions have areas of expertise and knowledge that when you combine them all together, you get Hojon, or you have a better perspective than if you don't have them or just one of them. And it requires daily balancing. It's not just a one-time shot. So once we figured out that we had some interventions that we weren't picking up and that people didn't support. And then we found out that our population wanted to move in a completely new direction, growing their own food. That changed everything. We had to change everything. So we had to redesign questions and priorities. And in that process, we gathered over 1,600 community needs assessments to determine new questions and priorities. That's where our information came from. We conducted 20 CBPR focus groups, which created new questions and priorities. And again, this is all focusing on food, traditional food, trying to recreate environments that existed traditionally, and trying to create mechanisms to share that food. And then listening to people confirmed our actions, and we got them involved. And all of our interventions were not our interventions. We were promoting them and paying for them, but they were all community interventions that belonged to the community, 100%, which was a big change from the organization that I had worked with, because they like to hang on to things and they took a kind of a welfare approach that, oh, we're in charge of that little patch of space and that's ours. And you can't do it until we get there. When I was like, no, it's yours. Take control of it. We're here to help you. Whatever you want, let us know. We'll try to do the best we can, but it's yours. It's your garden. It's your orchard. It's your built environment. And that was a really interesting thing, because once we learned that people wanted to move in a food direction, that everything turned around about food, producing food, preserving food, cooking food, and ovens was something that I was never anticipating. I have no background in building ovens, but in this process, people wanted to build ovens. So we had to look into Adobe oven making. But CBPR can find you, really help you determine what the community wants and help you set priorities to make that happen. And if we didn't use CBPR approaches or Navajo approaches, like which I consider like this, the two would go together, that we would not have been able to do what we did in the time that we were able to. And yeah, it changed everything. People wanted to grow food, and we figured out what's the best way to do it. So if we're working at a school, we had to have fencing because animals will come in and eat everything. We had to line some of the gardens with chicken wire underneath. So the entire garden is completely lined underneath the dirt. You just can't see it because we had to dig it under. So the gophers and different critters can't come up and eat the food because they were doing that at some of the sites. And ovens took a big place, and so did traditional food. And that created some interesting things because we didn't have access to a lot of seeds. So that was one of the things we had to work on. But CBPR revealed that students and staff wanted to grow traditional food, eat traditional food, give food away, make it available. Everything was about food, which we were happy because we were just a little surprised because a lot of the stuff we didn't know anything about it because we had also been disconnected. I'm colonized too. I'm not just saying I'm a fully indigenous person. I'm just as colonized as the next person. I'm happy sitting in McDonald's. So when people say, oh, we need traditional squash, I was like, oh, shoot, I don't know where we're going to get the seeds at, but we'll do our best to try to figure it out. So it really kicked us in the butt that we had to get off our butts and figure out how to make all this stuff happen. But when we did, beautiful things happen. We had full support from the community. Kids love this stuff. And these are just some of the pictures. We had actually taken thousands of photos, and we actually did a whole bunch of school gardens. And some of these gardens started a little late, and the ones that started late, we asked them, hey, just plant flowers, get used to the program. So you can see the third picture over was them planting flowers because they were a little late in the process, but they did a bunch of flowers and they were all fired up. And by the next year, they did an early planting. So they missed the first year, but they jumped on it the second year and they went full blown vegetables. So we encourage people, if you missed the vegetable season, plant flowers. Just get something in the ground and get used to it because that's going to be your lifestyle from now on. And they embraced it. And collaborative knowledge development and intervention design. Like I said, I didn't know. I mean, I have a little bit of a gardening background, but I had no idea we're going to be doing gardens on the scale we did, as many as we did and as big as they were. One of the gardens we started off as a 30 by 30, then it became a 50 by 150, and then it became 71 acres. It just blew up and that wasn't my thing. That was the community putting in their input and what they wanted to do. We were just there to support it. But at some places, it got so big that we really couldn't support it other than just paying for like fencing and drip systems and stuff like that, because they had gone in their own direction and just took off and basically just left us in the dust, which was fine because, that was what we were doing. We were the, promoting them and, being like cheerleaders and basically just puffing them up so they can do it. And they did. And some of the things that all the communities pretty much built an Adobe oven, and we just built a few of them so we could show them how to do it. And a lot of them got really, really good at it. So they were like steaming corn in there, cooking food, cooking pizza, doing all kinds of different stuff, luncheons and Friday night pizza nights, and doing all kinds of fun stuff. And that was because of the collaborative knowledge and interventions. It wasn't just us saying, here's what works, here's the best, Western best practice. They're like, oh, we like that, but we want to see an Adobe oven. We want to have our picnic tables. We want to have a community space. Cool, let's do it. And CDPR methods reveal what people really wanted. They wanted, food security, food justice. During this time, we planted over 500 trees, 200 berry bushes. We pruned some existing fruit trees in the southern part of the service area. What came up at one of the chapters was that the U.S. Army destroyed a bunch of trees and they wanted to replant them. And they asked us to do it. So we committed ourselves to it. And that's how we ended up on this fruit tree planting expedition. And remember when I earlier said that when the project comes to an end, it doesn't really come to an end. So this happened six years ago. And I was contacted by a community saying, hey, we still want some fruit trees. What can we do? So just recently, we applied for a grant from the Arbor Tree Foundation, the Community Roots Grant, and we applied for 5,000 trees, fruit trees, and we got it. So we're going to have 5,000 fruit trees. We're going to go back into 3 Navajo communities and 1 Zuni community, or Zuni Pueblo. So yeah, when I say a process doesn't come to an end, it should be sustainable. This is an example of it. 6 years later, we're still helping, or I'm still helping these communities with their different initiatives that they want. And that's because, I'm attached to institutions who are able to do that, like University of Arizona, Navajo Technical University. We also started an Indigenous berry nursery at St. Michael's Indian School. So if anybody on the Navajo Nation, you want to propagate some berries or start some berries, Indigenous berries, wolfberries, goji berries, blackberries, sumac, and raspberries, we have bushes over there. All you got to do is make arrangements to go dig them out and transplant them for free. It doesn't cost anything. You just have to go do the work. And those are berries that were indigenous to Navajo Nation before the ecological degradation. So traditional food acquisition methods and food systems rebuilding was top of the list. Everybody wanted to connect with food. And this was all new for me. I mean, I have a permaculture background, but I didn't have a traditional food background, and I didn't have any way of preserving and cooking and doing all the traditional food. I was basically a Western food vegetable guy. So I had to learn about traditional Navajo squash and corn and beans and different planting methods. Adobe ovens again were taught. They were almost at every intervention site. And it became a standard pretty much that everybody wants to reconnect with traditional food. Yeah, so it really took off, but there was also plenty of room for Western foods as well, like garlic, fennel, carrots, onions, melons especially. So asserting authority was key to starting the Navajo chapter health councils, the school gardens, community gardens, farmers markets, and worksite wellness programs. One thing that I really learned from this project was when people are in charge, sometimes they just need to be let to know that they are in charge and prodded to move things along, and they'll do it. And that's one of the things I learned from this. I didn't have to come across as, oh, we're from, so-and-so, and we're here to help you. No, it's like, hey, you guys are in charge. We're here to help you. These are some of the things that other communities are doing. Perhaps you guys might want to. And when they take a look at what other people are doing, they're like, well, we can do that. And we can do it better. I'm like, okay, cool. Well, let's get it on it. So that's our assertion of authority was really tribal sovereignty in action. And local groups had to create their own own institutions to support their programming. They created health councils, they created workforces, they did everything they could. They did their own seed banks, started their own wellness centers, and we were there basically just like cheerleaders, you know, ushering them on, saying, go, 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 here's some resources, here's some people who can help you. They also had to develop their own policies that would align and promote their actions. Like they had to create chapter resolutions and chapter policies. If they were a chapter, if they were a work site, then they would have to create their own internal policies, like a wellness policy. Schools had their own wellness policies that made room for the gardens and built environments. And so they really, it was really ushering them or prodding them along to create their own policies to support their policy systems and environments. The Healthy Denomination Act of 2014 passed, and our program started in 2014 and we began really in 2015 when it was created, but it took about a year for them to organize that. So I actually worked with them, the Navajo Community Development and Tax Commission, to figure out how that policy would look and how it would impact. And the only thing, my biggest contribution to it was getting them to adopt the Navajo Wellness Model, because initially it was just going to focus on physical interventions. And I thought, well, we have the Navajo Wellness Model created by our own people for our own healthcare and delivery systems, and it's a little more expansive. It has the physical, the emotional, the social, and the mental. And so yeah, so that's where that, oh, no, sorry, not social, emotional, mental, spiritual. And all of those really resonated with Navajo communities. So once that was accepted and adopted, it really took off. And like I said earlier, some of the community health councils were 102 years long. Yeah, and they still are. So I like that, the 102-year thing, because that's the Navajo life expectancy. So yeah, it's a long term. So it's intergenerational, at least 5 generations, and it can be extended. So many sites were able to fund their community-supported agriculture with HDNA funding. So the Healthy Generation Act is a junk food tax, 2% on junk food. It's several million now, and it's basically divided up into 110 chapters for community wellness projects. So all of these interventions qualify to be funded by the community wellness projects, or the HDNA funding at the chapter level. So that gave it some sustainability, but also that might not be enough. So some chapters were able to tie in workforce development programs to pay for youth to do the gardening and maintenance during the wintertime, or I'm sorry, the summertime. But the workforce development programs can actually be extended the entire year, because not only are you growing during the growing season, but you're also prepping and preparing sites and taking care of doing maintenance, taking care of trees year round. And it didn't have to come out of the chapter or the pitch budget. It could come out of Navajo Workforce Development. And they also have the chapter youth employment programs, which are specifically for the summer. So if you tie all those 3 together, you can actually put together a pretty good community supported agriculture program that would be funded internally. And you don't have to beg from Windrock or Washington, DC or Phoenix or Santa Fe. You can handle it on your own with what resources you have locally. And even today, some of the sites are still growing. Like Little Miss Muffet in Fort Defiance is huge. That site is getting better and better. And I'm just really happy. And I wish that other tribes would have their own Healthy Denomination Act so they could do something similar. Something about the little information about it is it's the only junk food tax in the United States that has not been overturned. When it did happen in 2014, several places, polities followed suit, but they've all been overturned. There's a few places internationally that have them, but in the United States, the Navajo Nation is the only one that exists. And it's not because of tribal sovereignty or we're really good. It has nothing to do with that. It's really just because it hasn't been challenged. If it was challenged and someone says, hey, Twinkies are my hojon, and if I have to pay extra for a Twinkie, I consider that unconstitutional. I'm going to challenge this. It would probably be overturned, but it just hasn't been challenged yet. But it could be. So it's a model, junk food tax, but it's very fragile and it just hasn't been tested yet. So one of the things that really tied all this together too is when we were trying to figure out how can we move forward with these initiatives and bring people together, we had to look internally, back to Navajo culture. And we have what's called the Navajo warrior ethos, which has existed since Navajos had hands, is that we are all warriors, every man, every woman, every child. And we fight equally in all battles, and we take action together. And a big part of this too is it's not about defense. Defense is the very end of it. It's really about preemptive strikes and taking the fight to the enemy. And with this project, it was really about what we can do as a community to work together to stop diabetes. If that's the monster that's at our gate or in our house, above our bed, it's everywhere. How are we going to deal with this? And we have to fight it, just like we did in the past with our monsters, with our enemies. They have to be met full-blown, preemptively, strikes, and have defenses, and just be relentless and work together until we can maintain them or control them, or at least let them know that we're here and we're not to be messed with, and that you have to deal with us as humans. Because monsters, they don't sleep, they don't discriminate, and they're going to take everything that they can, and they will, until we stop them. We have to do everything we can to stop them. So that became our public health approach to how we're going to deal with diabetes, no food, is that we have to be proactive. If we don't have food, then how do we meet that? How do we take the fight to them? Well, we grow our own food. We produce our own food. We stop waiting for someone to bring it to us. We stop waiting for a government or a business to create and then finally have access to food. No, it's not. No, we create the access. That's what it's about. So for people, practitioners and communities out there, other chapters or whatever, you can increase access to healthy and traditional food using traditional Navajo wellness model, Sa'an Nagai Bakeho Jean, community-based participatory research and native nation building. Any one of those or any combination of them works well. I would say if you're a different tribe and you don't have Hojong or those, you have your own traditional ideas and concepts, those work perfectly. You just have to figure out how to make them, plug them in, and it works really well. I mean, it worked for us, and we were able to replicate this over and over and over and over again. So I know it works. We've done it several times. I'm still seeing people carry it out today with projects that I'm not even a part of, but they've seen that it works, that it's a methodology, and they use it. And yeah, I get to see it. It definitely works. So it's creating Hojo by listening to everybody and hearing what they have to say. You make a plan and then you do it with them. So you don't do it in isolation. We do it together. So some of our outcomes after we were able to change the interventions at the end of the second and third year, we had 22 farmers markets in 9 locations. And that was just the officially pitched sponsored farmers markets. We actually had one community, cornfields, who thought that, your farmers markets are great, but we have enough food that we can have a farmers market every day until we run out of food. And they did. They opened up their own farmers market in the chapter house, and it basically ran from I'd say early September to the end of November. Yeah, they had almost 100 days, around 100 days of farmers market where they sold all the food grown in their community in the chapter house in dollar bags or quantities of $1. Initially, it was only for community, but they had such a surplus that they opened it up to just anybody who's driving by. And a lot of people drove by and would stop there and buy food. So even though we only had 22 farmers markets, if we include those ones, it was like 122. It was actually a lot more. We just stopped counting at 22 because people thought we were bragging and being too boisterous about that. But we were only supposed to have 2 or 4 of them initially. And the school gardens was, I consider, my big success because almost all those school gardens are still in operation. Actually, my son just brought home a bunch of vegetables 3 weeks ago from the school garden at their school. And he said, thank you. They said, oh yeah, you're the one who helped get this going. Teacher says, thank you. And here's some food. And I was like, oh, wow, cool. They're still producing food and a lot of it. And they were able to tie it in. What made those school gardens successful, we were able to tie it into the Navajo culture classes and the social science classes and the STEM classes. Yeah, once they were, that was one of the keys to making them successful in the schools. If you could get buy-in from the teachers in those classes, that they're going to be more sustainable than if it was just us coming in, doing our workshops and then leaving. This way it was in-house, internal, and it was theirs, their baby. And the 13 worksite wellness programs were really, most of those were chapter worksite wellness programs. And initially the worksite wellness programs were only supposed to be for people who worked at the worksite. But because the worksite was a chapter, that would have really only limited it to about 5 to 8 people. But because they made the conscious decision to open up to the entire community, now it became thousands of people involved. So 13 worksite wellness programs sounds kind of small, but it would actually probably include around 20,000 people, I would say, as an estimate. And they all involved changing the social ecology. That's why I wanted to focus on like how these two facilitation strategies of community-based participatory research is a community engagement strategy coupled with a Native American development strategy or social development strategy. When you put the two together, it's beautiful. And then when you combine that with the traditional culture and the local resources and what's at hand, everybody wanted to do similar things, or they wanted to do the same thing, but just done a little bit differently, tweaking it according to their location. So they all involved raising food, producing their own food, like adobe ovens and different stuff like that, and also empowering local community to change the environment by themselves or with little resources. No one wanted to bring in contractors or experts from Windrock or anywhere else. They wanted to do it themselves. And that's pretty much it. Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you. On the right hand over here, or the left hand, is the pitch staff. I'm in the middle, and on the other side are their interns. Some of their interns, the last year or the second year of the interns. Like I said before, if it wasn't for them, we would not have been able to have the impact that we did. We would not have been able to do anything close to what I would imagined. Yeah, it was all the local input and the community drivenness that really pushed it over the top and made it so viable that it can be replicated and transferred to other communities and adapted to different situations. And that's pretty much it.
Thank you so much, Matthew. What an astonishing project and program. How many years has it been to get to this point with this kind of adoption and successful outcomes?
Well, this program was from 2014 to 2017.
Mhm.
And then I went back to school at U of A to do my coursework, and I finished in 2019. I've been back here since, and I've been still using the same methodologies and everything, except now it's taken a different turn. Now I'm focusing on green infrastructure, but it still has the food element, still built environments. It's pretty much the same thing, just a little tweak and twist. But I'm still following the same thing, the native nation building as a social development strategy to mobilize the society and then to engage the community for ownership, CBPR, using KE as the Navajo version of CBPR.
No,
So,
that's
yeah.
what struck me throughout the whole thing is that this model, the approach, the indigenizing of the social ecology theory, the community-based work, that it could really be applied in a lot of different areas where you're looking for outcomes, like you said, green infrastructure, education. It seems like
housing,
yeah,
anything
wow.
really. It's a beautiful model. It's a recipe for success, really. And I learned about from school. I would have never learned about CBPR unless I took classes on it, and I would not have learned about Native Nation building unless I took classes on it. And then when I got out and I thought, hey, these two can be put together, and yeah, it works. It totally
Really,
works.
it's astonishing, actually. And I can see your enthusiasm for being able to put it out there for other communities, other tribes, to say this approach really has a lot to it and really engages people to take it on themselves.
Yeah, and that's one of the challenges that Native nations had since 1975 is, there's some tribes that are doing really successful, and most of them are not. What makes the one successful? This recipe. And so now
This
that's
is
kind of
it.
being adapted and unified and put out there, and people are tweaking it and adding a little more to it, or taking away from it. and it works. So, but this
Yeah.
worked for us. I'm not saying this will work for everybody, but this worked for us. And I've done this, I would say about 60 times, and it worked every time. We had 2 failures. The 2 failures that were 2 failures were basically we had a school that didn't have summer school and no one could take care of the garden in the summertime. And that was an
Sure.
administrative decision. It wasn't a community. The community wanted to support it, but the institutions within the community were not going to have summer school. So it just didn't happen. But in
Right.
every other case where the community had a say, it works.
Right. Right. Yeah, that doesn't seem like a failure of the approach. It's all of the elements, you know, all of the people that you needed to buy into that solution. We're not willing to commit at that point. But wow, wow. Well, congratulations on this work, and I'm really glad to have had the opportunity to meet you and to hear about it, so that maybe we can pester you going forward as we have other partners and people who are interested in looking to see if they can apply this model.
Yeah, well, I'm open for questions if there's any.
Yeah, I think we're about 22 minutes over time, so I
Oh,
want to be
shoot, I'm sorry.
respectful. That's okay. No, it's such a massive project.
I tried to slow it down. I could have went through it a lot faster, but I was thinking, shoot, I'm under time.
No,
sorry.
no. It's. I'm actually astonished that you got all of this information in in the time we had allotted, and maybe we can come back to you to come back and talk to our folks again and dig in a little bit deeper on some of the specifics that I want
Sure, I'd love to. And I'm sorry I went over. I don't have a time thing here, so I had no reference.
No, it's fine. It's fine. And it looks like most people hung in there the whole time. Really incredibly fascinating project. Thank you so much, Matthew, for sharing it with us. And we hope to see you again in another context.
Thank you.
All right. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks. Bye-bye.